Good afternoon, everyone, and we are back for Tech UK's Next Generation Infrastructure and Industry 4.0 stage at CogX 2021. It was amazing to just see speakers actually at CogX in King's Cross and my colleague Sue Daly, who has been on site this morning. However, for this session, we are now back virtually, and I am very, very excited for the session we've got coming up, which will be discussing edge computing and whether the next generation of business transformation will be at the edge. Now, edge has been a critical tool over the last 12 months, and it's not surprising since over 80% of data will be processed at the edge by 2025. And today on this stage, edge computing has been brought up time and time again, especially when we've been discussing both cloud and 5G. And it's really showcasing the role that edge computing will play in the coming months and years in bringing technology together. I am delighted to have the opportunity to chair this edge computing session for the next 40 minutes and to be joined by three brilliant speakers who I'm honored have been able to give up some of their time to join this session today. So without further ado, I am delighted to invite Stephen Patterson, who is VP of Public Affairs at Arm, onto the stage, to invite Kulveer Ranger, who is SVP of Strategy and Communications at Atos, and last but certainly not least, Caroline Gorski, who is Group Director of Data Labs at Rolls-Royce. Welcome all.
Hi, hello, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful to see you all here today. So without further ado, I think we should just get straight into the questions because we've got a number of really interesting topics to cover in just about 40 minutes. So to get started, and before we look at the future of edge adoption by businesses, perhaps let's just reflect on the last 12 to 16 months and how the conversation of edge has changed during the pandemic. If you think this conversation has changed, how so as well? So Kulveer, should we start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. It's great to be here, enjoying CogX, virtually. But isn't that the answer? Everything has been virtual. And part of, the high level point to this is that we've realized just how much more churning of data analysis and management we needed to do in different locations. Now, edge has always been about what's going to be happening between 2 points, that central repository or the cloud, and where some action was going on, where there would be something happening, highly data volume generating, and that link between them, and what would we do to make that more efficient. But the last 12 months has been a game changer because it's basically said, so much more is happening in so many different endpoints. We almost need to have to both turbocharge edge, but also redefine how it can be used at different points as we move from a business outcome-based perspective on edge to almost down to that individual-based discussion around edge. So I see that sort of overarching macro change in thinking really speeding up about edge execution and edge usage.
Thank you, Kulveer. So really looking at a macro change in edge computing. Caroline, do you agree?
I think what's interesting in the context where I approach this and previous to my role now leading artificial intelligence and data innovation for Rolls-Royce through R² Data Labs, immediately prior to that, I actually headed up the Digital Catapults IoT team, okay, where we looked at the kind of emerging spaces of 5G connectivity and edge processing. For us in the space in which Rolls-Royce operates, and you may have heard my colleague Paul Stein speaking about this with Sue Daly today as well, our vision of the intelligent engine is of course completely dependent on connectivity, but also on the ability to do more at the edge, to actually imbue the engine to understand itself and to understand what's happening to it at that edge point, as well as relaying that information back to our central service processing units, who can then make decisions about how to operate that engine more effectively and how to manage its maintenance and its provision of service more effectively. And so for us, it's part of a journey that started 30 years ago, but it's really important that we understand both what the demands are going to be for the kinds of processing and the kinds of intelligence we need to achieve at the edge, and also how we secure those edge device points.
Thank you, Caroline. And we're so thankful to have both you and Paul joining conversations with Tech UK today. And then finally to you, Stephen, it's so lovely to see you again, since you've worked on so much of edge computing with us at Tech UK over the last months.
Well, thanks for that, Lauren. It's great to be here. Yeah, look, I think Carolyn and Kulveer have kind of nailed it, really. The one sort of generalization I would draw out is this. I think the year we've just had, the pandemic year, has accelerated rather than revolutionized the trends we were already seeing in interest in edge computing. And you know, the overriding reasons why edge computing is a good thing remain regardless of the pandemic. Essentially, speed of processing, particularly when you're looking at the emerging areas of, you know, smart cars, smart cities, and all sorts of other applications that we can get into later if you wish. But I think what happened last year was that, you know, the focus on an awful lot of us working and living remotely has really highlighted the need to get some of this right. And just at this point, I will mention something which perhaps sometimes gets overlooked: delivery services, right? So, you know, we all got used last year to depending on deliveries coming to our door of all kinds of products. But the management of those, the tracking of customer orders, the management of inventory, the management of supply chains, you know, the new burdens imposed on those areas have been enormous. And actually, you know, edge computing or IoT, as Carolyn says, it is one of the best ways of managing those kinds of operations at that kind of volume. So yeah, last year has been important, but it's, I think, accelerated rather than revolutionized what we were seeing already.
I completely agree. And I guess just to add to that, it's also just raised so much awareness onto the crucial role of what edge computing has been, but also will be. And Stephen, you've already started touching there on what my next question was going to be, which is what are some of the most useful and innovative use cases of edge computing? So Kulveer, I wonder what kind of use cases are you seeing around edge computing, especially looking at 2021 and how adoption might have changed slightly?
Well, I think that's where, as Stephen and Caroline both said, you know, use cases are being evolving all the time. And I think, you know, let me step back a little before I talk about this year, because for the last probably 5 or 6 years, I was looking at a model when we talk about user-centric design, about a personal digital ecosystem that we'd all sort of created. We all have this development of hardware that we have of our own, our personal hardware. And I mean, laptops, iPads, devices, whatever it may be, smartphones. We then have our platforms, which enable those devices. When I mean platforms, I mean social media, Facebook, Twitter, even now these collaborative platforms. I think we're on StreamYard today. There you go. There's a bit of an advert for StreamYard. But these platforms are enabling collaboration to happen. And then there's connectivity. And that's where we're all paying for, no doubt, our broadband, our 5G. So you've got connectivity, you've got platforms, and you've got the infrastructure devices that we have. These are our personal ecosystems. And what's emerging through all the things that Stephen was saying and through all the increase in usage that we're cramming in to our own requirements are the need for more processing power within potentially that personal digital ecosystem. And when we talk about use cases, well, you know, whether it be how we manage our home infrastructure, and you know, from my device here, I'm definitely managing my heating, but also from this device here, I'm managing my vehicle, my electric vehicle, I'm managing my banking, all the stuff that we know is converging around the citizen. And then there's a level of that extended network that you go into with those services. So the heating system itself, the vehicle, as Caroline probably knows a lot more about than I do, but intelligent vehicles and how we are interacting with that. And you start creating not just the IoT network, which has been long talked about around, you know, how the Internet of Things will talk to each other, but you're creating strong central networks around an individual or a function, which are logging onto other networks. Now that's where you start then thinking, okay, further application of edge, because we need more of that processing to be happening within those sub networks, potentially for each individual almost going forward, because of the amounts of extra linkages and use cases they're plugging into. So I'm not sure if I've explained that exactly well, but it's basically evolving my own pattern of thinking about the personal digital ecosystem to add a large dollop of edge support into it.
No, you definitely did. And I think that was incredibly insightful. So thank you so much. Caroline, I don't know if you want to come in on that point at all.
Yeah, well, so if we think about the world that I'm sitting in is a world where complex physical devices, whether they are aeroplanes or whether they're trains or whether they're large pieces of agricultural equipment or whether they are power stations, right? So these are great big physical things that generate power for us to consume. And they need to be able to understand their specific contextual circumstances in order to be able to operate both at maximum efficiency and maximum sustainability. And so for me, when I think about edge computing, edge processing is something that happens when you need to be able to have detailed contextual sensitivity informing the operational parameters of, in this case, a physical device. It's further complicated by the fact that most of, if not all of the physical devices I'm talking about in my context, have a degree of safety criticality. So if they go wrong, that can be catastrophic. And so understanding, how do we think about the fact that central managed processes, which might be about trying to drive the maximum efficiency across a fleet or a network of devices, will need to have variability at the edge based on the specific contextual sensitivities that any device can pick up at its own time. But those routines which it then adapts need to be managed in a way which keeps their safety foremost in mind, and not only understands the safety of the individual device, but also understands any cascade that then happens out from that device across the rest of those network of devices. So it's a critically important area to get right. I think it's ever more important in those sectors that Stephen was talking about, the smart city, the smart transport, the places where big, complicated physical things interact with human beings who, by our nature have soft outer shells and not very hard exoskeletons. So we need to make sure that we get that processing right, and we do it in a way which is safe.
You've definitely touched on a crucial point there around security of edge devices. And recently at Tech UK, we wrote a report on business transformation at the edge, and we very much advocated for more research, both at an academic and industry level, on making sure IoT and edge devices can remain secure. Kind of just opening that out to either you, Stephen or Kulveer, is there anything you want to add around security? I know we're only a couple of minutes in and we've already deep dived into some of the pretty intense topics around edge, but I don't know if any of you want to add something to that.
Can I just pick it up, because I wanted to say something on the previous conversation, if that's possible?
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, I think what I want to say, and I think it was a kind of bit of a response to what both Carolyn and Kulveer said. Essentially what we've seen that's been kind of new in edge thinking over the last couple of years has been the notion that actually we can do even more computing even closer to the edge. So, and that's a kind of radical step. It's an incremental step, but it's pretty radical, because it does mean that you're now looking at, one of the buzz phrases now is tiny machine learning. You're looking at kind of, really small nodes that have sufficient computing power to be able to do some quite extraordinary stuff. And that, I think, begins to give Caroline the answer to her issue of contextually based analysis, or predictive maintenance of machinery or engines. You do need something that's contextually based. So you do need something that's able to recognize normal patterns, and of course able to recognize departures from normal patterns of behavior, and ring an alarm if and when necessary. So I think this movement of computing power closer to the edge and machine learning closer to the edge is one of the big steps which I think we've seen over the last couple of years. Sorry, I will just say a quick word about security, because of course, none of this is going to happen unless we get the security right. And a huge amount of effort is going into trying to make the system as secure as possible. I mean, it ranges from, if you like, self-evident things that if we move towards edge, we're going to have a lot more individual nodes doing a bit of computing. We're going to have a lot more local base stations doing some computing. So there's going to be a whole lot more of physical objects which might be physically vulnerable to attack. And then that's a simple thing. And then you begin to think of, you're creating a whole new digital interface for bad actors to interfere with. So we need to get the security absolutely right. And that's why I think increasingly the sector and governments are looking at how best to drive up the both demand for and supply of security. I mean, we're seeing it in the UK. The UK is finally nudging towards regulation on Internet of Things, consumer security. And I think you'll see that all over the world, an effort by governments really to focus attention on the importance of these objects all being secure by design right from the start.
Yeah, Stephen, if I might just add a comment there, if that's okay. I mean, so I think the secure by design ambition for IoT devices is incredibly important, and has perhaps in the last 4 or 5 years been dominated by thinking about consumer devices, which I completely understand, and it's really important that consumers can feel that they can trust the devices that they increasingly, trust their lives and their personal choices to. But it's hugely important in industrial IoT devices, and actually, when you look at the degree of kind of bad actor attacks that are targeting tend actually to target lower down supply chains. So they will go after the kind of tier 3, tier 4 players in a supply chain because they know that they are less likely to have the kind of perimeter level security that will have been wrapped around OEMs and the kind of top of the supply chain for a long time. But I think that brings me to the point that we've been exploring in R-Squared Data Labs over the last sort of 18 months or so around thinking about a different paradigm when it comes to securing edge processes and edge data. And it's specifically in our context, thinking about data. That doesn't mean that we don't think about the security of the physical devices too, but the change that we've seen has been in that data security layer. And I would describe that as being 5 years ago, your cybersecurity team would have predominantly been focused on placing a boundary around the outside of your domain as an industrial or corporate entity, and securing that boundary and then putting another boundary behind it and then another boundary behind it. And it's a bit like building a castle, where you've got a moat around the outside and then you've got a big high wall behind the moat, and then you've maybe got, some pits with stakes in behind the big high wall, and then you've got another big high wall, and then right in the middle you've got a tower. And that's how we kind of approached cybersecurity for the last goodness knows how long. And actually, when you think about edge-based processing, you need a different paradigm. You need a recognition that you need to secure quanta of data. So you need each individual data domain, each individual functional entity of data to be able to secure itself and to be able to present its security credentials back in to do a handshake to allow it to come into the system to be processed. And that is a strategy for cybersecurity, which is at the cellular level. It pushes security all across the body of your data context. It doesn't rely predominantly or even only on a boundary around the outside.
Yeah, but I would completely agree with Caroline there. There's been a dramatic shift in the approach, the strategic approach to cybersecurity on many levels. And, we're at Atos. We're number one in Europe for providing cybersecurity. We protect the Olympic Games, and will do this time as well. The most attacked event that goes on in the world. And I think, one of the things that is critical here is that as we move to an edge environment, the level of vulnerability does increase, as Stephen was mentioning. And I think it's all of the above and more that we need to look at. It has to be by design. It has to redefine the strategic approach. So it's not the sort of firewall legacy that we've been talking about for almost decades, haven't we? I can't get through the firewall. Oh, great. No, I want to get through the firewall, and so on and so forth. We first faced it as we found businesses wanting to interface with each other's data stacks and systems, and suddenly OT networks, the strength of those, more complex installations, such as Caroline was saying, whether it's the managing of power stations, utilities, government services, as we do all of these things globally. The cybersecurity question remains the number one point, because if we cannot maintain trust and integrity, then everything else does fall down. And in fact, as a manufacturer of these things, and we've obviously been building it into our supercomputers, our quantum computing, but our edge servers, we know, and I think Steve mentioned this, that the challenge is going to be both physical and digital. Because suddenly you're going to find a lot more of these everywhere as well. So there's a multitude of new dimensions that we have to continue to think about around cybersecurity, but it's all coming together in the context of this service, because whether it's your vehicle that's acting as a server, and we all know the difficulties of keeping a vehicle secure, but now it's got a further potential vulnerability to it, or whether it's your home, or whether it is your device, whatever it may be, we're just going to have to continue to ramp up the 360-degree approach to the protection that it has, and it has to be agile. It basically can't stand still. It has to continually be evolving to defeat the kind of challenges that you keep seeing coming through through the attacks.
I guess just building on that then, we're clearly highlighting here that security is such an important part of edge adoption, but for businesses who are just starting to understand how they want to be using edge computing, this conversation could get very overwhelming very quickly. So what advice would you give to businesses who are just kind of starting out on understanding how to secure their edge network? Kulveer, I can see that you were nodding slightly there, so should I go back to you?
I nodded because it can be so overwhelming to any size and scale of business as soon as you start highlighting some of the vulnerabilities that they might have, and it can be all too much. But I think that it's about now having this integrated, rather than, and another point around cybersecurity is that initially and for decades it was considered as a thing on the side. Oh, by the way, I also need some security. I also need a firewall. I also need something to help me protect my data. Well, this is not an also. This must be on the main stage as part of fundamental design, development, procurement. Everything must be integrated. And as we go into this world where we all want that flexibility and the kind of opportunities that both edge computing, IoT, everything will provide us the freedom to use, then it must be, there's no choice, it must be safe and secure. And I just use the example always of people banking on mobile devices. Maybe 5 years ago, people were so fearful of doing it. Now, people don't bat an eyelid. They feel secure around what they're doing through personal financial transactions. We know that there is an ever increasing role of bad actors out there who are continuing to try to, probe and test and get access through the most vulnerable, but will continue to evolve. But it isn't an option. It's integral to everything going forward. So I don't think people need to think of it and get overwhelmed by it as a separate activity. It will be incorporated into everything we should be doing going forward.
Yeah, I think if I can try and chip in on this, Laura, a bit.
Of course.
I think the first thing to say is that I think, and I hope and think that as we move down this road, companies will discover that security is marketable. That people will actually increasingly look out for the security credentials of the connected products that they are buying, and I think that will be very helpful in driving up interest in putting security into products. Secondly, I wanted to say, I don't think we should think this is too difficult. I mean, yes, I entirely take Kulveer's point that the security challenge is an ever-evolving one. But there are, a number of organizations and companies out there who are trying to keep, up with it, if not ahead of it. And there are kind of recipes for security out there. I should say, one of my part-time jobs is I chair something called the Internet of Things Security Foundation, and we've got a checklist of steps developers can take to make their products secure. There's an outfit called PSA certified, Platform Security Architecture certified, which has got something similar. And all of these organizations are mapping their steps against the emerging regulations. So, you can say to a developer, look, if you get your chip and it's done in this way, designed in this way, if you get your software and you develop it in this way, if you do this, 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 and this, you can be pretty sure your product is going to be pretty close to conforming to emerging regulatory requirements. So I think we don't want to scare people off by saying, oh, this is going to give you a terrible headache, bury your head in the sands and don't think about it. I think what we want to say to developers is, look, security is marketable, and actually there are tools out there that make it easier than you think.
I think you've raised a really crucial point there, Stephen. So thank you for coming on that point. I'm surprised that time's already started to get away from us just a little bit, and we've had a really interesting question from the audience, which, just to say, if you are in the audience and you would like to send questions across, please do. You don't want to just hear from me this entire time, and I'm sure you've got lots of questions you want to ask. But we have a question from John Lewis, and Caroline, this is for you. He says, many of the large pieces of the plants described by Caroline earlier on in the conversation are also operated by people. Isn't one of the challenges of edge computing to understand the context and the perspective of those operators?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it goes quite a long way outside the remit of just talking about edge computing, if I'm honest. Because I think that so if I step into the whole context of my role, one of which areas is about how you take artificial intelligence forward in a way that augments human intelligence. To be successful in doing that, in developing and deploying computing machine learning capability in such a way that it offers the potential for human beings to do more of what they're really good at and less of the things that either a computer is better at doing than they are, or that frankly are not jobs that human beings necessarily particularly want to do. To be able to do that successfully, you have to be really closely connected into understanding what human operators do and where it is they are enjoying their jobs and where it is they are successful in their jobs, and where it is that reskilling or retraining or adapting them to work alongside compute machine learning could actually improve efficiency, but also improve the nature of the work that they do. So I think it's a bigger question than simply in the context of edge computing, but it's certainly true that when you look at a process which is predominantly delivered by a human today, and you start to introduce machine principles and machine learning into that process, unless you understand at a very intimate level the impact that has on human beings, you are very unlikely to be successful in deploying that process.
Thank you so much for giving such an insightful answer there. And of course, if we ever talk about augmenting the workforce, obviously that is a conversation about edge, but it's also a conversation that goes far beyond that as well, and including different forms of emerging and transformative technologies. Hoping that's
on this, Laura, just not
of course.
Just a quick thing. So I was on a panel the other day, and I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember who said it, but I'm at least attributing this line to someone else. I just can't tell you who it was. Maybe if they're listening, they'll let me know. And this person said they reckoned there was a universal law of technology discussions, which was that sooner or later, any discussion about technology gets down to a discussion about people and processes. And it sounds like one of those things that kind of, I wish I'd thought of that kind of thing. And it's kind of partly true. Yes, of course, people and processes matter. But actually, the technology matters too, right? I mean, we now live in an age of we've all got used to end-to-end encryption. And I think, and Caroline was alluding to this, one of the issues is that, yes, our data is encrypted in transit and in storage, but actually when it's being processed, we still need to struggle a bit with processing encrypted data. So, but the technology will evolve. And of course, once the technology does evolve to a particular point, then indeed it's people and processes, but people and processes isn't the only answer, obviously.
Of course, yeah. And obviously doing a number of panels, people and processes, you're kind of right. Our conversation does always end up coming back from that. Before I move on to the next question though, Kulveer, do you want to come in on any of the points that have been raised at all?
No, I think Caroline and Stephen have covered that area quite well. There is always the question of, and I think we're moving on to that point around how is edge going to facilitate, whether it be machine learning, but actually going on to the AI conversation. That's where we've thought that AI may be applied is going to be dramatically changed because we have access to edge computing power in different locations. And I think that's a question that also starts coming up back to Stephen's point, or whoever's point it was about, where people are doing things, where the processes are going to change will depend on where we can deploy the power of edge processing and then move that onto an AI conversation. So there's a huge scope undefined so far about what could potentially be done in different areas.
Of course, and that leads quite beautifully on to my next question. So thank you, Kulveer. Looking at edge computing, the way that you can derive most value from edge is through its convergence with other forms of emerging and transformative technologies like cloud and like AI. So taking that into account, where do you think we can get the most value of edge computing when we combine it with which different forms of technologies? And Stephen, I'll go to you for that one first, if that's okay.
Well, no, thanks. I mean, I think Culver's picked it up very well. I think it's AI, right? So I think if you look back, I mean, the reason why edge computing is taking off is because of the speed of processing, and sooner or later you get to a point when if you want really fast processing, you need to be doing it in combination with AI as close to where the data is collected as possible. So you're looking at this gradual migration of AI closer and closer to the edge, what we call endpoint AI. And I think that is what's coming, and the use cases are I think pretty compelling in certain cases. I mean, we Arm, for example, know of a couple of companies that are using, full disclosure, Arm-based technology in a couple of health devices, and one of them is for asthma sufferers, and it learns how to monitor and measure a patient's inhalation. And therefore to be able to detect, because it's learnt the regular patterns, to be able to detect minor variations in that pattern and to send alerts accordingly. And there's another one, which is a device which is another area that we haven't talked about really, but uses voice recognition, which I think is going to be another growing bit of the whole edge computing scene. But this one, it listens in to emergency calls to the emergency services, to ambulances and ambulance services and first responders. And it will prompt the first responder to ask particular questions according to an analysis of the voice of the person phoning in. So if you assume the person phoning in is feeling very unwell and they phone in, and from the way they're breathing, the way they're speaking, the sounds they're making, this device will immediately prompt the first responder to probe particular areas of inquiry. And and those are two just quite sort of early devices which are using AI processing on the device itself to be able to enhance the way in which we can look after patients. And I think that whole area is where this is going to go.
That's really brilliant examples that you've given there, and especially seeing use cases in healthcare as well. It's so crucial that we're highlighting those at a time like this. But Caroline, I'd be really interested to hear maybe some examples that you have.
Well, interestingly, actually, I have a couple of healthcare examples too, and I know that doesn't make an awful lot of sense given that I lead AI and Rolls-Royce, the power generation company. But a lot of what we do with our data labs team is that we do experimentation in multiple different sectors, and work with partners from different industries to understand how the work that we're taking forward can have an impact. And so in some ways, quite similarly to the example that Stephen gave, about 18 months ago, we worked with the Motor Neurone Disease Association to build them a very early stage prototype for helping sufferers from motor neurone disease to have an AI that could make recommendations about the kinds of words that they wanted to communicate with based on analysis of their own emails and text messages and previous conversations. You may understand that MND sufferers lose the ability to speak because they lose a lot of the muscle control of their larynx and their throats. And actually being able to very rapidly listen to the emerging sounds coming from someone suffering from MND and make recommendations based on their own vocabulary that they have used previously in various forms of communication as to what word they're trying to say is much faster than using and more evocative of that person's personality than using the kind of pre-recorded speech choices that you might select with a pointing device or with your eyes if you've completely lost the ability to control your throat muscles in order to speak. So that was a very interesting space. Now there, what we're applying into that is an understanding of elements of acoustics and how sounds tell you things about the state of in this case, people, but in the context of Rolls-Royce, we use sound to tell us about how part of an engine is working and whether or not it's actually vibrating in the right frequency in order to be able to tell us whether it's healthy or not. So you can see how that read across sort of happens between two quite unrelated domains.
Definitely. Another really great use cases. They're really pushing, really looking at what the future of edge computing adoption is going to be like. So thank you so much for that. Already time is getting away with us, and I did want to cover just one more topic really quickly and give you all the opportunity to round up at the end. So very quickly before we finish, and Kulveer, I'll direct this one towards you. Edge computing can bring a lot of environmental opportunities, especially when compared to cloud. But there's a lot which is still not known about the environmental impacts of edge computing. Can you explain some of the opportunities or considerations we need to be looking at when we're discussing adoption of edge?
Yes. Look, firstly, we're really proud at Atos because we've embedded decarbonization into our work around system design, data management, service delivery, digital services for a number of years now. It's why we're number one in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index for major services provider, because we do that across all our activities. But we're moving forward at such a pace, and the ever increasing challenge of data production, data transfer, data usage, especially with the explosion of cloud and what's driven the edge conversation, cannot drown out all the benefits that we've already been identifying in how to decarbonize technology networks. And what we've been doing is designing better, building for better capacity, better energy efficiency, how our structures are done, so in terms of usage of computing power, and the design of the whole system. So that's where, and even actually to cooling. So for example, we designed our supercomputers so that they have cooling inbuilt, again, to improve the efficiency and use of energy through what they're doing. But this now needs to continue with the development of edge servers. And we're absolutely committed to having the most efficient way of designing these things going forward. Because again, as much as I think there are two conversations that it comes to when it's about how we're going to deliver edge computing. We've had the first one about making it secure, ensuring that we're focused on cybersecurity. I think equally weighted must be the conversation of decarbonization. And we cannot leave that on the side. Again, it must be built in. It's going to be integral, as everybody we know is aiming for net zero and everything we need to do around net zero. We're quite focused now on net zero and beyond. We've targeted to be net zero by 2028. That's our ambition, and working with all our supply chains and customers and partners to help them get there. Edge computing is going to be such a large conversation going forward. It must also have net zero and decarbonization integrated into its design.
Thank you so much, Kulveer. So we do only have a couple of moments left, and I know that edge is such an ambitious topic to cover in just 40 minutes, and you've all been such great speakers. I just want to give you all just a sentence to round up what your thoughts are on edge computing now and what you think the future is going to look like. And Stephen, I'll start with you if that's okay.
I don't know, I can encapsulate it in a sentence, but I'll try and link the two things. I mean, one of the reasons why a lot of this stuff is attracting interest is that it does enable us to use resources more efficiently and effectively. And that's where, if you like, the climate change agenda and the digital agenda meet. And I think if we handle this right, actually the advance in edge computing can further our climate change objectives.
Thank you so much. Caroline, to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really like the way that Kulveer talked about the ambitions for carbon reduction and getting to net zero in how we think about moving forward into all spaces of data processing and edge as part of that. But what I would say is that this needs to go beyond simply thinking about how edge devices and edge computing can help other processes to be more carbon neutral. We categorically need to be able to get to the point where we have a circular economy for these devices, so that let's just be really, put the cards really on the table. We don't have enough cadmium. We don't have enough lithium. There are so many of the critical materials that we need to do all of the things that we want to do to build our future. If we don't start working out better how to reuse them, as opposed to simply using them once and then throwing them away, we're going to find ourselves in a real pickle.
Thank you for highlighting that. I think that's an incredibly important conversation, which I wish we had time to dive into a little bit more. But finally, Kulveer, to you to round up the session today.
Well, thanks to everyone who's listening. I would completely agree with what Stephen and Caroline just said, but particularly, it was way back 2010. I was working for the then Mayor of London, and called Boris Johnson, and I took on the environmental brief there. But I also set up the digital office for London. And that wasn't what the mayor was asking for. He was saying, we need to do more about the environment. How do we get to do more? How do we get people involved more? How do we make it the right decisions? And it was about data, but it was about visualization. It was about understanding the use of technology to help us be better at it. And as Caroline says, we need to think about circular economy. We need to think about the 360-degree approach to this if we're going to get to what I say net zero and beyond, because it's not just net zero one and done. This is something that's going to keep going as our requirements grow. So let's use that power that comes through to make it more visual, make the awareness there. Let's not just have EDGE as something that people think as a concept and it gets delivered somewhere. People will need to understand it to help us solve the challenges that come from it as well.
Exactly. And I think that's a brilliant point to finish on. And just to kind of encapsulate that and bring it all together, technology and digital transformation inherently needs to be good for people, planet, and the society. And hopefully this conversation today has really showcased the role of edge computing in playing that. So just to say thank you to all three of you for coming along and sharing the stage with Tech UK today. And thank you for sharing so much of your insight. I'm delighted to have you here with us. After this session, we are now going to take a 15-minute break, and we are then going to be back with Sue Daly, who is my colleague at Tech UK, and DeepMind to discuss the future of data center technology. Thank you all for listening in.